Good afternoon and welcome to the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas online public lecture series. My name's Dr. Matt Killingsworth. I'm the Head of Politics and International Relations at the University of Tasmania. I'm also the Chair of the Tasmanian International Humanitarian Law Advisory Committee, and I'll be your MC this afternoon. To begin today's lecture, it's important that we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which our meeting is taking place. As a reflection of this institution's recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, the University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Palawa people, and custodians of the land upon which we meet, and pay respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Now, the Island of Ideas seminar series is a program designed to keep the ideas flowing during this period when we were unable to host live public events. Each year, the university presents hundreds of lectures, forums, seminars, and workshops free of charge for our students, alumni, and the wider community. And these are an important part of the university's role, and it's why we're hosting forums such as this afternoon. A couple of housekeeping matters before we move on to introduce today's speaker. The first is that your microphone, camera, chat function and raised hand function have all been disabled. That's so our speakers won't be interrupted. You'll also notice that today's lecture is being recorded, and by acknowledging that, you've been able to stay on in this particular seminar today. Although those functions have been disabled, we do encourage you to use the Q&A function down the bottom of your screen to ask questions. So once today's speaker has finished up, I'll be moderating those questions. We'll try and get through as many of them as possible. So today's lecture is the 2020 Red Cross Oration, and this springs from a collaboration between the University of Tasmania and the Australian Red Cross. The purpose is to contribute to the advancement of public understanding and interdisciplinary dialogue concerning issues of human significance in the contemporary world. The Oration, now in its 13th year, is presented by an internationally renowned speaker and has the primary purpose of introducing to the wider community issues that connect broadly with the values and principles of the International Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement. So it's my delight now to introduce Michael Lanier, who in turn is going to introduce today's speaker. And Michael is the Director of International and Movement Relations for the Australian Red Cross. As an international development and humanitarian professional, Michael's experience spans both humanitarian and development action across the African and Asia Pacific regions. Michael joined the Red Cross Crescent movement in 2002, has worked on posts in Sudan, China, and for a decade as head of Asia Pacific disaster management. And more recently has led the work of Australian Red Cross International Program across Asia Pacific and the coordination of strategy and relationships with Australian humanitarian partners. Michael will speak on behalf of Red Cross and introduce our speaker. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Matt, and good afternoon and welcome to everybody. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands on which we all sit and meet today, but pay special respects to the traditional owners and continuing custodians of the lands on which the University of Tasmania sits. I'm Michael Lanier, the Director of International Programs and Movement Relations at Australian Red Cross. And as Matt said, today is the 13th Red Cross Oration. This year, we weren't going to let COVID stop us from hosting the event. So like everybody else, we've gone virtual. Our theme this year is climate crisis. And just like COVID, climate crisis impacts every aspect of our lives, from the way we earn a living to how we move around our cities, connect with each other, feed ourselves and enjoy our leisure time. Climate change is the biggest humanitarian challenge our society is facing. Every day at Australian Red Cross, we are responding to the increasing humanitarian impacts of climate change as a critical issue that cuts across all areas of our work. In coming years, as climate change poses an ever greater existential challenge to individuals and communities, our role in reducing risk and addressing the needs of the most vulnerable will become even more critical. Beyond the direct costs of increasing disasters, we are already seeing the detrimental psychosocial impacts on health and well-being from more frequent, intense and protracted disasters and silent crises like drought and heat waves accentuated by our changing climate. Climate change is a force multiplier for many of the existing challenges people already face in their lives. It's even more challenging for those who are socially isolated, who are homeless, who are living with a disability, experiencing mental illness, or living in a remote community. Climate change is affecting billions of people worldwide. Our own study by the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, the world's largest humanitarian network, estimates the number of people in need of humanitarian assistance as a result of storms, droughts and floods could climb beyond 300 million annually, compared to an estimated 108 million today. Closer to home, the Black Summer bushfires is a frightening wake-up call, with about 12 million hectares burnt. That's an area nearly double the size of Tasmania. And for a nation accustomed to increasing heat, it's worth noting that according to a Lancet report, globally 157 million more people were exposed to heat waves in 2017 compared to the year 2000. And 153 billion hours of labour were lost globally in 2017 due to heat. We can't afford to face disasters at this scale on an ongoing occurrence. Disaster resilience and risk reduction is critical to prevent staggering human, environmental and economic costs. As part of our membership with the Australian Business Roundtable, we commissioned Deloitte Access Economics to assess the future costs of disasters. They predicted the cost would rise by more than 300% to a staggering $49 billion a year by 2050. Yet we know for every dollar spent investing in disaster risk reduction, savings of between $3 and $8 can be made. The Red Cross established a global climate centre in 2002 to facilitate cooperation between the scientific, policy and practice communities, highlighting the humanitarian impacts of climate change as a critical issue underpinning all our work. Working together, we will leverage the unique role of Red Cross can play working alongside communities made vulnerable by climate change, and seek to amplify their voice and support actions to build adaptive capacity and strengthen community resilience through our programs. So on that note, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Amanda McKenzie. Amanda is one of the best known public commentators on climate crisis in Australia. She is the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of the Climate Council, an independent climate change, education and advocacy body. Previously, Amanda co-funded the Australian Youth Climate Coalition and has served on renewable energy expert panels for the Queensland and Northern Territory governments. Amanda was the founding co-chair of the Centre for Australian Progress and is a former board director at Plan International Australia and the Whitlam Institute. She holds an honours degree in law from Monash University and an arts degree from Melbourne University. Amanda has won numerous awards, including being recognised as one of Westpac's 100 Women of Influence and a finalist in Telstra's Young Business Woman of the Year Awards. Welcome, Amanda, and over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, and it's lovely to be here and have the opportunity to talk to you, even though we're all in different places in the world right now. I simply wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which I'm working and living at the moment, the land of the Wurundjeri people, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging as well. This area around Melbourne is, I'm in an area to the northeast of Melbourne that is, and on the Yarra River system, which is a really beautiful part of Melbourne. And as we learn more and more about the climate crisis, and particularly in the, around fires, we learn more about how the traditional owners have preserved and enhanced the landscape over millennia, and there is a lot for us to learn. So I'm sure that you've heard and read a lot about climate change. So here I'm reminding us all what is at stake. And I wanted to contextualize what is often described as an environmental problem as a deeply human problem, and provide a call to arms for what next for all of us as we work together to protect our collective home. So I thought I'd start by asking you to board a spaceship with me. Let's pretend there's lots of little ones all over the place that we're all getting on board. And, you know, perhaps Elon Musk has gone and invented a whole lot of little solar-powered spaceships. So we're going to take off from where we are right now, and we're looking down on the earth. We're seeing the city and the streets, perhaps Hobart, perhaps it's Melbourne where I am, shrink below us to the size of toys. And we're seeing the suburbs around expand below us, and I would now be able to see maybe Bass Strait opening up and connecting me with Tasmania. If it was during the Black Summer, we would have seen huge plumes of smoke down the east coast of Australia, at times covering most of New South Wales, Victoria, and down to Tasmania too. But here we are in wintertime and we don't see that. We see this shimmering green jewel of the Australian coastline. And as we go further and further away, there it is. We look back and we can pause and see the earth as a whole, this opal suspended improbably in the deep chasm of space, potentially the only oasis of life in the vast desert of the universe beyond. I always think it's strange that in science fiction movies, we imagine that aliens would come to Earth to rob us of our resources, our water or our minerals. There's plenty of those resources elsewhere in the universe, but what's unique about our planet, Earth, is life. All of us are these brilliant, have inside us these brilliant creative molecules that evolution has developed through millions of years of trial and error. Enzymes, protein, DNA, and these amazing molecules and chemicals work together to create billions of breathing, thinking creatures like us who have the capacity for love, for empathy, for the ability to then study the universe beyond us. So if aliens were advanced enough to travel the universe, I think they'd be scientists searching for complex life. What is amazing about Earth is life. So looking back from our spaceship, it's somewhat humbling and awe-inspiring to see this beautiful opal in the universe, and to think that we've just scratched the surface of understanding our planet and the life forms that inhabit it. But we can have the opportunity to talk about climate change from that distance. And the issue seems much more simple. You can't see the lines between countries. You can't see the squabbling of politicians. You can't see the clamouring of vested interests. You can't even see the coal-fired generators that are spewing out pollution. We can see our atmosphere, the array of gases wrapped around the world, because we can see the water vapour swirling in bright white clouds. If you've ever been in a greenhouse, you'll recall the warmth when you step through glass doors and you're able to feel the warmth around you from the outside. But if we could take a huge step now from our spaceship to the ground, we'd feel the temperature change dramatically, because just as the glass of a greenhouse traps heat, those gases swirling around our atmosphere keep the Earth much warmer than space. And this climate change inherently is very simple. The science is very simple. It says that if we burn fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas, for energy, for transport, for industrial processes, all that pollution gathers like a greenhouse and traps heat in our Earth system. The more we burn, the more heat that is trapped. And that heat is the energy that fuels more extreme weather events. And so for the last 200 years, we've been polluting and the temperature has been rising. And as that pollution has accelerated, temperature rise has accelerated too. And we're now, as we can watch from our vantage point in space, this is a great, unprecedented experience. We're doing an experiment on our whole planet at once. And it is obvious when looking from outside the Earth, the fallacy of imagining that the environment is somehow separate to humanity, that our economy is separate from the environment. I remember a classic Clark and Dorr episode on 7:30 when called The Front Fell Off, where Clark was an oil executive and he was explaining to a journalist why the front had fallen off an oil tanker, leading to massive amounts of oil pouring into the ocean. And he claimed that they had towed the tanker beyond the environment. We often act like that. We consistently act as if there is some place outside our environment for our waste, for our pollution, when of course it's all around us. And the atmosphere in itself will never adhere to human boundaries. I started working on climate change about 15 years ago, and my motivation was a concern for human suffering. At the time I was working with refugees, I was hearing harrowing stories of displacement. I was a law student at the time, and I was working with people right at the end of their quest to be recognised as refugees in Australia. And they were usually presenting with a range of physical and mental ailments at that stage. Some people had been in Australia for 5-7 years, pursuing their claim for refugee status. I then read a book about climate change, which helped me to understand what we all now understand, that climate change is making extreme weather events more frequent and more forceful, that sea levels are rising, that will have great impacts on all of the systems on which humanity depends. And what struck me early on was that would lead to immense human suffering, and that the vulnerable would suffer the most. And that's very clear in any sort of disaster, but the worse the disaster, the more difficult it is to recover from, and the poorest people generally suffer the most. So I, having been working with refugees, what was obvious to me was that this sort of suffering would lead to huge human displacement. So 15 years on, and I've been working on climate change for that time, what is clear is that what I had read about at that time in the scientific literature is now jumping off the page into our lived experience. The Black Summer bushfires are a real obvious example of this. Thousands of homes were lost, 1 billion animals perished, many people lost their lives. And as I said earlier, fires were burning from rainforests in southern Queensland to rainforests in Tasmania. It was, there was times in which almost every major forest on the East Coast was on fire. And it seems like a long time ago now after the pandemic or during the pandemic, but it was obviously just a few months ago. And communities are still only starting to grapple with what a rebuild will look like. And it illustrates very clearly that climate change is a deeply human problem. The communities that were impacted by Black Saturday more than a decade ago are still affected, of course, by the scale, the ferocity of that fire, wiping out whole towns. And these fires will be even worse. 80% of the Australian population was affected by the bushfire smoke, with 450 people losing their lives as a consequence of the smoke alone. So this is a human catastrophe. And in Australia, we have more resources than many other places to be resilient, as resilient as we can be to these sorts of crises. But still, the Black Summer was absolutely catastrophic. In 2019, heat waves in southern India killed more than 1,000 people. It was 47 degrees in some places. And you can imagine if you have no access to air conditioning or any cool place, it is incredibly difficult. So people that are in poverty tend to be much worse affected by these sorts of events. There's also analysis that the Syrian war and refugee crisis, that climate change has been a factor, exacerbating drought, which then led to a cascade of different events. So people moving from the agricultural land into urban centres, and a flow-on effect that was a factor in the war. And that's the sort of thing that is will become clearer over time, that as you get these ecological disasters, how it flows across into human societies and makes the stability of our systems more difficult. So the other thing that struck me at the time when I was learning about climate change that actually is playing out is that this was also an amazing opportunity for humanity to collaborate, to see past our differences, to innovate, to solve other intractable problems at the same time. So, for instance, we now know that the number one solution to tackling climate change is educating women and girls globally. So this also tackles poverty, it tackles gender imbalance and a range of other things. But educating women and girls is about thinking through women being empowered to make decisions about their family and having children. And what is the analysis that is being done is around population growth worldwide, and that educating women and girls is going to be a crucial step in tackling climate change. A lot of progress has been made in the 15 years since I started working on climate change. One statistic that, Australian statistic that I find really motivating is that when I started working on climate change around 2005, 2006, there were probably 1,000 homes with solar panels on the roof. Now there's over 2 million Australian homes that have solar panels on the roof. So the community has voted with their feet and made a really big difference. And sure, part of that is about reducing electricity costs, but also it's about people taking control of their power and having a positive impact on the environment. We've also seen a lot of collaboration and stepping up. The Paris Agreement, signed in 2015, was an amazing effort of people around the world to bring together countries to find a mechanism for getting a degree of unification around this issue. And there was a lot of powerful leaders. But what I think is important is that it, rather than being a top-down process, it is genuinely about being, as much as it can be, a bottom-up process. It's about empowering people all around the world to act. In the Australian context, there's what the focus of the media conversation has been is the lack of federal government action. And that's absolutely valid, because there has been a total failure of federal government action in the Australian context. But on the other hand, if you look underneath the federal level, you look at state governments, you look at local governments, you look at communities and business, there is a huge amount going on. The Climate Council, we run a project called the Cities Power Partnership. We have 125 local governments that are now part of that program, that are there reducing their emissions, they're advocating for change to other levels of government, they're investing in projects for their community. It might be a floating solar farm in Lismore, it might be a bulk buy of solar panels for their community in the Strathbogie Shire in Victoria. There's a huge amount going on nationally. And the community, of course, is getting together in lots of different ways. The school strikers globally in the last few years have been a really potent example of that. Greta Thunberg from Sweden has obviously been a major catalyst for this, but youth movements on climate have existed now for about a decade. And the reason that Greta's call to action could be so effective on the ground is that people were already organising. So that call then hit to people on the ground that were ready to then mobilise their people to say, yes, we'll get out there, this is a great idea. And in Australia, we saw the highest per capita protests of anywhere in the world for the school strikers, which was a really amazing thing to see. The Climate Council's story actually starts with community as well. You might recall that we were previously a government body. We were the Climate Commission, and we were established in 2011 to provide accurate information to the Australian public on climate. And the Climate Commission was principally about getting experts together and providing a platform for those experts to educate the community. So world-renowned climate scientists and climate change experts. Unfortunately, the first act of the Abbott government was to abolish the Climate Commission. And I was a senior advisor on that commission, and I talked to our commissioners at the time and said, the work we're doing is really important. We're worried that as the government changes, that there will be cuts to the CSIRO and the Bureau of Meteorology in the way that they can communicate on climate change, which indeed did happen, and that there will be a real gap, that is a really important piece of the puzzle. So a few days after we were abolished in 2013, we got out on a limb and said, hey, we're going to establish a not-for-profit. I hope you'll come with us. It's got to be funded by the Australian public. And within a week, we'd had 15,000 people giving us on average about $20 to put back together the Climate Commission, now as a not-for-profit, the Climate Council. It was amazing the first day. I remember waking up in the morning and it had just gone out on, the website had launched at 12 midnight, and we'd already been raising money at $1,000 an hour. But in the morning, it just exploded. It hit the media, and I remember clicking refresh on my browser, checking how much money we were raising. It was going up at $50,000 a half an hour. By the end of the day, PayPal had to shut us down. They thought we must be money laundering. We're raising money so quickly. And the amount of money that was raised in that 10 days, $1.3 million, was more than the budget of the previous Climate Commission. And being outside of government has given us a lot of flexibility to do things innovatively, differently, to be really responsive and flexible. So, for instance, the Cities Power Partnership program with local government has been one of those initiatives. But a lot of the work we do is really about, firstly, providing an information base to the general public on climate, and then secondly, helping to shift the public discourse. So we do a lot of work with other communicators, not just our scientists and communicators, but for instance, over the summer during Black Summer, we established a group called Emergency Leaders for Climate Action. So that's 30 former fire chiefs and emergency chiefs, led by Greg Mullins, was one of our councillors, who was former New South Wales fire chief. And they've been enormously effective because they can speak to audiences with a huge degree of authenticity to say, hey, these fires have not happened before. this is climate change. It's getting worse. The government needs to do more. And they put out warnings in April last year that the fire season would be terrible, that unfortunately weren't listened to. So they became incredibly effective advocates over the summer. So that's a little bit on, you know, climate change is a really big problem. It was a big problem 15 years ago, and it's really starting to play out in ways that are probably worse than what scientists anticipated 15 years ago, or definitely worse than what they anticipated. It's happening much more quickly. But there's a lot happening to address it. In the Australian context, I think it's really powerful, the Climate Council story, because it shows just how passionate citizens here are about tackling the problem. And there's a lot going on globally. But of course, there's a huge amount more to do. We need to escalate action dramatically, as we then will also experience the impacts. So we need to be preparing for those impacts. And we need to be doing both at the same time. 15 years ago, the sort of piece of how do you cope with climate change wasn't as much front of mind, but now it needs to be absolutely front of mind all over the world to ensure that we have resilient communities. So I wanted to just talk to the moment that we're in now. So right after the Black Saturday fires, we experienced another big disruption, this time globally with COVID-19. And it rightly took our attention away from climate change and the fires to the immediate health crisis. But now, as the health crisis has reduced a bit, in Melbourne it's obviously continuing, but for most Australians, the health crisis is not as much a day-to-day concern. We're really talking about economic recovery, and that's what's on everyone's mind at a government level, and it's one of the biggest topics to be discussed because so many people have lost their jobs. In Tasmania, there's been relatively large job losses through the lockdowns, with a 9% drop in payrolls and 10% fall in total wages. And young people, the arts, hospitality have all been hardest hit. So if we're going to be tackling economic recovery, we can do it in a number of different ways. There's going to be money spent, there's going to be effort and resources put to things. So how can we channel that effort towards setting ourselves up better for the future? And that would then mean tackling big issues like climate change, trying to find win-win solutions that create jobs and get down emissions at the same time. So we're making sure we use this moment to be tackling the next economic shock. Climate change, of course, is an economic shock. The bushfires show us that. And the economic analysis shows just how devastating, consistent, more ferocious and more frequent extreme weather events will be for Australia. So in the Tasmanian context, there's a lot of opportunities. Tasmania already has a target to get to 100% renewable energy by 2022. But we can go far beyond 100%. You need to move away entirely from fossil fuels. And there's a staged process in doing that, of course. But there's an opportunity for Australia as a renewable energy powerhouse to be exporting renewable energy to the world. And in the Tasmanian context, of course, exporting renewable energy to the mainland. Tasmania's got such a high proportion of renewable energy because of the hydroelectric scheme, but there's also lots of opportunity in wind power as well as pumped hydro storage. So basically pumped storage is that you pump water to the top of the hill, and then when you need it, you release it and it drives a turbine, creating electricity. So it acts like a battery. So there's a lot of opportunity in that too. When we, as a Climate Council, did a big piece of research last year looking at what has been the motivators of change in Australia over the last 10 years on climate change, where has there been progress? What we found is it was often driven by small jurisdictions, local governments or state or territory governments that had done initiatives for the first time. They'd done them well, they developed the business case for it, and then it had been adopted much more widely. The ACT is a great example because they did so many useful things, a reverse auction process, for instance, as a policy mechanism for building more renewable energy. That, as a policy mechanism, has now been taken up right around Australia. So a smaller jurisdiction can try new things, can be leading, and then that models change for other jurisdictions across Australia, but also across the world. So Tasmania has a great opportunity, already having so much renewable energy, to demonstrate what it means to be a renewable energy exporter and to create that really exciting proposition about how do we not just solve our own challenges. We need more jobs. We need, to build more economic prosperity here. But how do we also make that a win-win? So it's tackling a big global problem that has huge ramifications for Tasmania, like climate change. The other big economic opportunity in Tasmania in responding to the COVID crisis is an ecosystem restoration and revegetation. It tends to be jobs that are low skill, so people who have lost their jobs in other sectors can move into those jobs quickly, and it can be high impact because it's quite easy to scale. There's lots of areas that need regeneration. There's lots of agricultural projects that or agricultural land that needs restoration. So there's lots of opportunities for win-win. So what we're doing at the Climate Council at this point is really trying to work consistently with local governments, with state governments around Australia to provide the information that they need around how to do this economic recovery in a way that can benefit all of us for the long term. Of course, this again, obviously is not without its challenges. You've probably heard that the federal government is talking consistently about a gas-led recovery, which would be a big problem. Gas is often touted as being less emissions intensive than coal, which is true when you look at just burning of methane. So methane itself, when burnt, isn't as polluting as burning coal. But what often is not looked at is the whole supply chain for gas. So there's leakage when gas is mined, there's leakage when gas is transported. And methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. It's about over 80 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. So it's not without its, it can be a huge contributor to climate change. It can often be actually as bad as coal when you put together the whole life cycle of gas. And the idea that you can have a fossil fuel that is a transition fuel away from coal is an argument that could have been made 20 years ago and would have probably been a valid argument then when renewable energy was a bit more expensive. But now renewable energy is a cheapest source of power, new power in the world, and in Australia in particular. We've got enormous resources. To go down the gas pathway at this point from a climate perspective would be crazy. Then there's the economic proposition. Is it a good idea economically? Don't we just need jobs at this point? Well, since Australia connected our gas market to the international market and our pricing, it's connected it to global oil prices, which has introduced a huge degree of additional volatility in gas prices. The main reason electricity prices have been growing in the last 5 years in many parts of Australia is the cost of gas. So again, it's one of these issues that it's sort of like there's a shift. We want coal is great, coal is great. Oh, actually gas. The social license of coal has been so damaged that it's hard to advocate for coal. Also the economics are just disastrous. So now we're moving on to gas. Gas is great. It can be a transition. It can help us move to renewable energy. All of that is a set of myths that unfortunately would have us set down the pathway to another group of fossil fuels that we would need to be moving out of if we're going to tackle climate change. We simply just don't have the time to invest in more fossil fuels, even if they're less polluting than coal. We need to use this opportunity to invest in renewable energy and industries that can set us up for the future. And of course, tackling climate change isn't just electricity, although that is the lion's share of the debate, fossil fuels versus renewables, etc. But there's also a whole range of other solutions, whether it's in transport, I mentioned revegetation, landscape change. Landscapes can take up a lot of CO2 and store it in the landscape. So there's a huge amount of solutions to climate change that need to be factored into our recovery plans. There's some good research out on that now. Beyond Zero Emissions has done a really good piece of research, which is out in the public domain. WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, has done some great research in that area too. And the Climate Council will publish some economic modelling in the next few weeks in this area as well, providing guidance for governments as to how you can do economic recovery in a way that makes sense for setting us up for the future. So I wanted to conclude by kind of going back to the start of my presentation, I was thinking about what to speak about today, and the description of the oration is that it needs to focus on an important contemporary issue that has a distinctly human meaning and significance. And earlier this week, I talked to my daughter Matilda, she's 2 years old, about the speech. And I asked her what she thought I should talk about. And she said to me, "You should talk about how much we love grandma." And I thought, well, that's, you know, most parents think what their own child says is pretty amazing. And I generally think that about my child too. But I did think that that was actually an important thing to finish on. The pandemic has reminded us that we live in a society, that our health, our well-being, our safety is inextricably linked to others. And in responding to the pandemic by aggressively preventing the spread here in Australia, we've been protecting the more vulnerable, older Australians, people fighting cancer or a pre-existing condition. We're protecting the health of our health workers and everyone that might need hospital services. So it's been looking after my mum, Matilda's grandma, who's in her 70s, and that's really important. So the economic recovery needs to also be about protecting people, and this time about setting up for Matilda's future and the future of all the kids around the world. At the moment, their generation is on track to have a really tough time. On current trends, the accumulated loss of wealth due to reduced agricultural productivity as a result of climate change is projected to exceed 19 billion by 2030, 211 billion by 2050, 4 trillion by 2100. These sort of statistics are easy to sort of roll off the tongue. They're huge numbers that we can't really imagine, and timeframes that seem really far away. But in 2030, Matilda will be 12. She won't be old enough to have had any meaningful impact on this issue. And basically, it will be decided what her future will be by that time. We will probably, there's certain thresholds that get referenced regularly in climate change that are not well understood. The first is 1.5 degrees and the second is 2 degrees. So I mentioned at the start of my speech that the issue around climate change is global heat, that temperature globally is rising on average. So it's risen by about 1 degree so far. And 1 degree doesn't sound like much because, you know, temperatures change so much just in one day. But if 5 degrees is the difference between an ice age and a warming period. So 5 degrees is, you know, New York under a kilometre of ice versus New York as we know it now. So 1 degree is actually really substantive. 2 degrees is considered a threshold under which we should not cross because it would be difficult for humanity to maintain civilization. This is the types of language that scientists use. And what they mean is that the level of change would just be so vast that it would be very difficult for humanity to sustain the type of society which is developed under the current climatic conditions, which has supported our agriculture, which has supported our fisheries, which has supported all of the systems that support human life. So just as an example, the Murray-Darling Basin at 2 degrees would basically be a dust bowl. 1.5 degrees is considered what would be preferable to going beyond 2 degrees. So in the international language around climate change, the agreement, Paris Agreement says we should stay below 2 degrees, but even better would be to stay below 1.5 degrees. Once you pass 1.5 degrees, you've basically lost the world's coral reefs. Coral reefs provide huge resources in terms of fisheries that are relied on by people around the world, particularly in Asia, where, you know, a bulk of the world's population lives. And we're coming up to that threshold now. So as I said, temperature has risen by 1 degree, but there's a lag time between global temperature and the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So we've been pumping carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and that's gradually raising global temperature, but there's a lag time. So the emissions from a couple of decades ago are leading to the temperature rise that we've seen now. So we're now getting to the point where we've released so much pollution into the atmosphere that we are likely to get up to 1.5 degrees and be unable to stop it. So it just underlines just how important it will be to keep emissions down from now onwards. And Matilda's generation, as I said, will have no capacity to stop this. They will be just in the coping phase. They will be experiencing things getting worse and worse. So I think it's incumbent on all of us that have the capacity to respond in whatever ways make sense to do that. And Australia's done well in responding to COVID because we've listened to experts, we've acted early, we've worked together across political and state lines. And that's exactly the type of qualities that we need to bring to tackling the climate crisis. I think for all of us, it can be difficult to find a sense of purpose and drive when we're at home often all of the time now. I know that I find working within four walls is often kind of draining. I get a lot of my energy through movement, through dialogue, through traveling to meet with different people and speak to different groups. And reality has now become my immediate environment and the internet. Basically, there's no middle ground of moving around in the world, and I think that reduces our sense of can reduce our sense of purpose and agency. But I think regardless of that, it's a time when we're privileged to live at a time when we live at a time that really matters. So what can you do? I think that action is always the antidote to despair. And there's three areas that I encourage people to work, to think about their treasure, their time, and their voice. So treasure, support organisations that you think are doing good things. At the Climate Council, we're trying to double our size and thus our impact. So we're really focused on increasing the amount of donations that go to us to help us do more impactful work over time. And I know that there's a lot of great organisations doing just that. Using our time, that's really about finding ways to get emissions down, but not just alone. I think it's really vital that we work together. So thinking about local governments, thinking about local schools, the University of Tasmania as a vehicle where people can work together and with others to reduce emissions and create examples that can be shared with others about how to do just that. And the final one is use your voice. We all have a voice in this conversation, and obviously some are louder than others, but we can do a lot to be ensuring that those that are elected to represent us are consistently hearing from us around what we think must be done. And it's not just about talking to the federal government, it's about our local governments, it's about our state governments, because what we know is that lower level jurisdictions are actually the ones that can get things done that are then being replicated in other places. The only reason that Australia's emissions have not accelerated has been because state governments and local governments have been acting. So I just wanted to end with a really brief story. I took you to a different location at the start, going to space. Now I want to take you to Africa. And this is a story I heard from an African activist many years ago now, and I often use it because I think it's really powerful. So we've gone to Africa, we're in a forest, but it's nighttime. So all the animals are asleep and it's dark. Then we hear some thunder rumbling across the sky, lightning strikes, more lightning strikes, and a tree catches fire in the forest. It starts to be consumed and to spread to the bushes and trees around it, creating a large fire. The animals all jump up in fear and run away, and they gather on the top of the nearest hill watching as the fire starts to consume their homes. And they think, what are we going to do about this? There's nothing we can do. The smallest animal of all, the hummingbird, goes past them and drops a single droplet of water onto the fire. And then goes back to the river, another droplet of water, drops it on the fire. The elephant says to the hummingbird, what do you think you're doing? You can't possibly make a difference. But the rhinos are inspired and they go and start stomping on the fire. The monkeys are inspired. They get banana leaves and start dousing the fire with big buckets of banana leaf water. And eventually even the elephant comes late to the party and puts the fire out with his trunk and then celebrates his success. This story says to me that we are all small and individuals tackling such huge challenges that seem way beyond us, but we all have a role to play, and you don't know when you throw that pebble in the water just how far the ripples will spread. So thank you for listening, and I think we can jump into any questions.
Brilliant, Amanda. Thank you so much for a wide-ranging and engaging presentation. We've got a lot of questions. lined up. So the first question is from, we've got about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. So the first question is from Craig, and he's got a question that relates to a recent event. And he's asking about, in some ways, the depressingly predictable announcement of defence spending yesterday that identified national security in a sort of a traditional guns and bombs way. Is there value perhaps in identifying climate change as a security risk?
Absolutely, and it is certainly a security risk. You look at the Black Summer we've just had and how the Army had to be mobilised to assist, even in the Australian context, to respond to the disasters, and that's often true in the Pacific as our Defence Force gets involved. Defence, across the board, the security agencies have been engaged in climate change for many years now, and it's mainly been behind the scenes in terms of how they're responding. It was in the most recent white paper, but there's far more that needs to be done. Sheryl Durant was a member of the Defence Department who's been working on this issue for many years, and she's just joined the Climate Council as a councillor. So it's actually going to be a big piece of our work going forward. And I think it helps to connect to different audiences, to think about climate change in a different way, that this is inherently an issue for Australia's security going forward.
And I think that's a really important part of your presentation today, which is highlighting the multifaceted aspect of climate change. That and you've talked about advocacy a fair bit as well, and sort of what people can do. And we've got a few questions that ask about Extinction Rebellion, and Cherie is asking if she needs to really glue herself to the road for people to pay attention to the magnitude of climate change as an issue.
I think that in any movement, there needs to be a spectrum of how people advocate, and Extinction Rebellion plays a role in opening space, if you like, on the far flank to say, hey, we're not going to put up with this, and really creating a huge challenge. I think that you need to work out where on that spectrum you think you can be most effective, and I think it's about thinking about your circle of influence. Who can you connect to? Who can you influence? So if you're a school teacher, you can think about how your school as an institution is responding to this. If you're a parent, you might want to join Parents for Climate Action, for instance, and they do a whole range of different things. There's lots of groups that are emerging that are create opportunities without necessarily having to go down the direct action path, although direct action can be a really important tactic in social movements, and we've seen that in the US just in the last few weeks around Black Lives Matter.
Referencing the US, I also really liked the point that you made, and when we're talking about climate change, it can often be depressing, especially if we focus just on the actions of the federal government, both here in Australia and in the US. But I really liked your point about perhaps looking below those levels politically as well. So local government, even state government, and we see this in the US often as well, the intransigence of the Trump administration, yet genuine action being taken in big states such as California, for example.
Absolutely, and California is, I think, the 8th biggest economy globally. So what California has done has been really important in shifting the dial. They're going to 100% renewable energy. That will have a flow-on effect across US states. Similarly, when California changed its vehicle emissions standards, that had a big impact across the rest of the United States in terms of not just shifting policy, but also changing, they're a big importer of cars from California. It shifts the market overall. So I think we can too often just rely on the federal government to act when there's been 15 years of mainly inaction with some good pieces like the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, for instance. But now it's time for everyone to find a way to step up into tackling the issue.
One of the themes that have come through in the questions is about the politicized nature of climate change, and not just here in Australia, but globally as well. And a number of people have pointed out the issues with short-termism. There was a question about a front-page headline of the Australian newspaper about being lied to about climate change. is there value in depoliticizing, or do you have to sort of hyper engage with the politics of climate change?
It's a really interesting and difficult question. My view is principally we need to depoliticize the issue. We need to get to a point where there can be bipartisanship, because we can't continue the yo-yoing around policy and the dragging forwards and dragging backwards. So one of the pieces of the puzzle that we've been really engaged in is working on bringing out other voices on climate change. Too often it's just been the politicians, the policy wonks, the scientists. It's about finding people who are at the front line of the consequences and of the opportunities. So we do a lot of work in supporting, I mentioned emergency leaders, so firefighters to speak out, doctors, solar installers, people who are revegetating land, farmers, that can speak to climate change with a different lens and say, hey, this actually really affects me. This isn't about a conversation just with our heads. This is about hearts too. And this is about making it really relevant to different communities around Australia. I think we have to assume the best in people, and that people aren't just trying to be difficult if they're against. So for instance, North Queensland gets a pretty bad rap around climate change, that, you know, they're a bunch of coal lovers. I think that people in those regions want jobs and they want security for their families. And there's been a lack of engagement and trust from government over a long period of time. And it's up to organisations like mine that want action to go and have a dialogue with people about what the opportunities are outside of coal. And in doing that, what I found is people are not just supportive of coal for coal's sake. They're supportive of coal because they think it will bring jobs. So where there are alternatives, they get it, they're ready to move. But it's about meeting people where they are.
Michael, a question for you, if you don't mind, and this is related to the movement, and this is related also to something that Amanda was talking about earlier, about the clear link between climate change and national emergencies. How sustainable is our ability to respond to disasters, for example, like last summer's fires?
It's a great question, Matt, and I think the COVID situation at the moment has actually brought that into the front and centre of the conversations we're having across the Red Cross Red Crescent movement. We in Australian Red Cross and the Red Cross overall is really looking to invest in building that capacity of a local civil society, so that an entire response to disaster and crisis events can be supported by civil society actors, can be supported by government, private sector, all coming together to harness resources. We saw a little bit of this in the floods that happened in Bangkok in 2011, where a lot of the private sector supported the Thai Red Cross, for example, and the government in responding. But equally, a lot of this comes back to the individuals and communities themselves. So within Red Cross, we've developed a number of resources here in Australia that can help with regard to becoming climate ready, for communities to become climate ready, and for individuals and their families to understand what is of value for them, and how they may be impacted by climate change. So that overall response requires the whole systems perspective, from an individual, from a household, from a community, from the civil society that supports community, and then the policymakers and the private sector as we go ahead. We do know that climate change is going to create new forms of conflict. There's going to be scarcer resources. There'll be more conflict around access to water, these type of things. So it's going to be a huge task ahead of us all.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. I was quite taken by your story of Matilda, Amanda, and her early engagement with this. Does the Climate Council work with schools, and to what age level do you think it's should students or children be introduced to the importance of climate change?
I think that we don't, as the Climate Council, do a lot of work with schools, although we have a lot of resources that are used by teachers. Groups like the Australian Youth Climate Coalition does a lot of work with young people. I think that it is a genuinely really frightening issue, and that young people, I think we need to give young people opportunities to engage in the issue. They're coming across it anyway. I think that the idea that you cannot educate children about climate change assumes that they're not aware of what's going on around them, and they are. And so for myself, I remember learning about climate change when I was 6. That was in 1989, and I was reading in an encyclopedia. I don't know why I was doing that, but I was. And I learned about it and I got really scared about it. And I don't remember talking to anyone or having any views about it. And it was only when I came back to it then when I was at university and started then actually getting into climate change that sort of got working on it. But if I was a 6-year-old able to access it in 1989, most kids are aware of what's going on to a degree. And I think it's up to us as parents, as teachers, as educators, as community members to help them understand the issues and also what their agency can be.
We've got a couple of questions that I'd be really keen to hear your answer to. And they're sort of in 2 parts a little bit. So the idea of how do you engage with climate deniers, for want of a better term, and then sort of on the other side of the flip side of that in some respects is, and I think this is perhaps even more important in the current circumstances, do you have any advice for those experiencing climate anxiety?
Yeah, both good questions. I think what we know in terms of the public opinion research is about 70 odd to 80% of people accept that climate change is happening, it's bad, something needs to be done about it. So it's actually a very small proportion of people that are genuinely denying that climate change is happening. It's, under 10%, and denying that it's happening and that we should do nothing about it. Increasingly, there's a group of people that say, oh, it is happening, but it's not that bad. And the solution is gas, or the solution is to wait and see how things occur. That's a sort of a bigger group. It was interesting over the summer, for instance, at the very start of the bushfires, the coalition nationally was denying that climate change was a factor. And they were saying, you shouldn't talk about climate change. We should talk about climate change at some other time. Well, of course, the fires raged all through the summer. And by the end, Scott Morrison acknowledged that this was climate change exacerbating these type of extreme weather events. So it's sort of 2 camps. I think on one side, when it's a very high profile person that is influencing others, it's really important to come out and make sure that the record is corrected. So through the summer, we thought it was absolutely critical that we're out there consistently saying this is climate change, and challenging those that were not, were either denying it or saying we shouldn't talk about it. But generally, when I come across climate deniers, I don't think it's worth much engagement because it is quite a small percentage of the population. So it's really depending on how influential they are in your circle or in the public discourse. In terms of climate anxiety, I think the first thing is just to acknowledge that it's a very reasonable thing to feel. I think that the change is all around us, it's scary, and it's going to get worse, and we know that clearly. It can be I think it can be something that people working on the issue just try and push down and just act. And I think, as I said earlier, action is often quite an antidote to the feelings of fear and grief. But I think that we all, as we experience climate change, need to acknowledge that we have feelings about it, and that's okay, and to experience them, to talk about them, lest they sort of build up. And I think that's what leads to burnout, if there's a lack of acknowledgement, and finding things that help us to feel grounded in our current reality. I think when you work on climate change a lot, you spend a lot of time thinking about the future rather than the present moment. So my daughter helps me a lot with that. Having a 2-year-old brings you back to the present moment pretty quickly. And I find that actually really helpful for my mental health, coming back to, okay, well, actually we're just going to do Play-Doh right now. And that's going to be the whole focus.
Yeah, I must admit, I find my 9-year-old as a bit of a reality check for things like that as well. It's nice. The students that I teach in international relations, one of the things that we focus on is how do you confront a global issue in an environment that is organised politically around states and borders. Mm-hmm. And so I wondered if you'd care to talk for a little minute in some of the time we've got left about the relationship between climate change and globalisation.
I think the Paris Agreement is a good place to start on that conversation, because previously, before the Paris Agreement, global action had been perceived as being very much a ordered top-down process. We all need to agree on our targets, and that's how we then reduce emissions. Whereas Paris sort of flipped that around and said every country should be bringing their targets, and then we're sort of held accountable to what we bring. And I think that what Paris did was change the way that countries were looking at the issue. So I think that framework was very useful. The other issue is just what you do when some states are going to be recalcitrant and some states are going to be leaders and all of that. I think that it's just a very challenging problem. But in the Australian context, I think we can acknowledge that although Australia is relatively small economically and population-wise, in terms of emissions, we're large. We're the 15th biggest emitter. That means that there's over 180 countries that pollute less than us. We're the 4th or 5th biggest exporter of coal and gas. So there's great opportunities for us to take leadership. But the final point I'd make is that thinking about states presumes that the number one actors globally are going to be nation states in dealing with this problem. And as I said in my presentation, I think we need to think differently about it. I think where the leadership has genuinely come from has been sub-state jurisdictions. There's been businesses, companies like Unilever, for instance, going to 100% renewables. It's been communities, it's been individuals like the Greta Thunbergs. So I think we should think about leadership in a different way. And I think about the ideal case in Australia is that Australia would be leading the world. But if we're not going to have the federal government doing that, let's make sure our business leaders are doing it, our state governments are doing it, our local governments, and that we're sharing that information very widely.
Time is not our friend, but there is a group of questions, and for people who've asked them, forgive me for praising it. In your presentation, you spoke about the disproportionate effect of climate change on those already most vulnerable. And in particular, you spoke about women, for example. There's a question here on the possibility of climate change exacerbating already existing conflicts. Did you care to talk a little bit more about perhaps responses to that and the magnitude of that with respects to climate change?
It's a really good point. I think if you look, and Michael would know these statistics better than I do, but globally, women tend to be poorer in general and have less access to resources, be more oppressed, etc. So women tend to be in a group that are more vulnerable. And so when you have a disaster, it's generally worse for women. We've seen this in the Australian context around bushfires, for instance. There's a spike in domestic violence after there's been bushfires in different locations. So there's a whole range of ways in which human behaviour is interrelated with environmental consequences. So I think that it goes back to the core point I really wanted to get across in my presentation was that this is a human issue, and it does exacerbate almost every other problem globally that exists. Climate change will make it probably worse rather than better. But if we're tackling it, thinking about win-win solutions, how about if we can do multiple things at once? So educating women and girls is one of those opportunities that does empower women. It is an opportunity for women often to enter the workforce or start having a role in the economy. It's about empowerment. So it can tackle multiple issues at once.
And I think that's a really good place for us to end today, that you did address the multifaceted part of that, and I introduced it, but I think, and especially with the importance of the Red Cross's work, that if we do think about it as a humanitarian issue, then that also provides pathways, I think, for both advocacy, for response, and ways that we can perhaps lobby political leaders as well in that respect. So on that note, Amanda, thank you so much for your presentation today and your question and answer. So I'm sure everyone would like to join me, albeit silently, in thanking Amanda Mackenzie for her presentation today, and also thanking Michael and Nia for hosting today. And so on behalf of the University of Tasmania and the Red Cross, thank you both so much for your involvement in in today's Red Cross Oration. I encourage people to have a look on the University of Tasmania website for upcoming events. And with that, thank you so much for your attendance today, and hopefully I'll see you in upcoming events. Cheers.